So today I'm going to show you a wonderful recipe for a no-knead focaccia, which is extremely easy to make and it's going to be an absolute delight to eat. Now I'm going to finish it off with a few different toppings and it's going to be golden and crispy on top with the most wonderful fluffy and light crumb in the middle. So firstly, I'm just going to get busy with the dough for this recipe, and I always like to start by dissolving the yeast in the water. So here I have 375 grams of lukewarm water, and I'm just going to add 7 grams of baker's yeast to it. So just get that in there and just give it a quick stir. Once the yeast is fully dissolved, next I'd like to add in 50 grams of an organic rye flour, followed by 450 grams of plain flour. Now if you don't want to use rye flour, or if you don't have it, you can just skip it and go ahead and straight away add in 500 grams of the plain flour, or for our friends across the pond, this would be an all-purpose flour. I'm also adding 8 grams of salt, and lastly add in 50 grams of an extra virgin olive oil. So next I'm just going to start mixing all of these ingredients together using my Danish dough whisk, which I use especially when I make sourdough bread or focaccia bread. It's just because these two breads have a really high hydration dough, and if you start mixing the ingredients by hand, then this is going to be a really messy business. So I'll just start mixing these ingredients together, and soon I'm just going to end up with a really rough, shaggy dough. So as you can see, at this point we're now left with a really rough and shaggy dough. And also this dough is really wet. So what we are going to do is just cover the bowl with a lid, or if the bowl that you're using doesn't have a lid, feel free to use a clean and damp tea towel. Just cover the bowl and leave it on the side for it to rest for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back to it to perform a few rounds of stretch and fold. So 15 minutes later, and I'm now going to start performing a few rounds of stretch and fold on this dough, as it's really wet still. Now the wet dough is really hard to work with and you can't really handle it or knead it, otherwise we're going to end up with a huge mess. Now with the stretch and fold technique, on the other hand, you are going to help develop the gluten network in the dough and the gluten structure, and that really becomes less and less sticky and a lot easier to work with. So all in all, we want to be performing 3 rounds of stretch and folds with a 15 to 20 minute intervals in between each round. So the dough is now looking really good after performing 3 rounds of stretch and fold, and I'm just going to cover the bowl again with the lid and just let this proof for anywhere between 1 to 2 hours until it doubles in size. So while this is fermenting, we can discuss toppings. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to get a few different toppings onto this flatbread, and rosemary is a classic when it comes to focaccia. So I'll start preparing the garlic as I'm planning to roast it. So a few cloves of garlic, and I'll simply get these onto a roasting tray which is lined with some tin foil, and just drizzle with some olive oil and just simply cover the garlic with foil and pop it into the oven around 30 minutes at 160 degrees Celsius. And that's for the olives and tomatoes. There really isn't much you have to do in terms of preparation apart from slicing the olives and cutting the tomatoes in half. I have a roasting tray here, or you can use a cake tin if that's what you have, but generally something with a little bit of a lip on it. Now, the key to a good focaccia is a nice amount of olive oil. So just cover your roasting tray or the cake tin with a good amount of olive oil, and try and get some of that on the walls of the tin as well. And just transfer the dough onto your tray and just try and encourage it into every corner. Now, if you're finding yourself struggling to get this to spread out nicely and easily, you can just cover the tray again with your tea towel and just let it rest for around 15 or 20 minutes, and then it should be a lot easier to spread this out and, as I say, encourage it into the corners. So that is what I'm going to do now. Alright, so back at it again, and I can see the dough has spread out into the corners a little bit more, and essentially when you let the dough rest, the gluten in the dough relaxes and it becomes a lot easier to handle. Now, just a little dousing of olive oil on top, and now I'll just get the toppings onto the bread. And with the rosemary, I'll just get a bit of olive oil onto the sprigs, and this will essentially stop it from burning when it goes in the oven. So it's now just a case of scattering it all over this flatbread. At this point, I'd like to get some dimples into the dough, which at the same time pushes the toppings into it as well. And now I'm just going to cover this again with my tea towel and let it rest for another half an hour for it to get a bit more volume before it goes in the oven. Right, so back at it again, and this is now looking good and it is ready to go into the oven, which I have preheated at 230 degrees Celsius. So anywhere between 25 to 30 minutes should bake it really, really well. After it's had its time in the oven, this has come out and it's looking golden and beautiful. And at this point, you can just douse it with a little bit more of your olive oil and just cut right into it. Look at this. This, in my opinion, looks absolutely fantastic. That crumb structure is looking really good for the minimal amount of work that you have to put into it. Now, I like to have this with a little bit of aged balsamic vinegar and a good quality olive oil. So let's try some. I really hope that you enjoyed this bread recipe and that you're actually going to try this for yourself at home. In fact, if you are going to do that, why don't you drop me a comment down in the box below, letting me know as to which of these toppings is your favorite and which one of these is what you're going to use to top your focaccia with. And I guess that's been it for this video. I'll be seeing you in the next one very soon, but until then, look after yourselves and remember, the secret ingredient is love.